Hey everyone. Have you ever stumbled upon something that just doesn't fit? Something that contradicts everything you thought you knew about a place? Something that appears on old records, seemingly solid and real, but is completely absent from the world today, leaving only questions and a chilling sense of unease? What would you do if you found a persistent geographical feature marked on multiple historical charts off the coast of California, a stretch of coastline you know intimately, surveyed countless times, only to find that feature utterly, inexplicably, missing from every modern map, every satellite image, every official nautical chart? It started innocuously enough, as these things often do. I was spending a rainy Saturday delving into digital archives of historical maps, a hobby that borders on obsession. Specifically, I was looking at early United States Coast Survey charts of California from the mid-19th century. These documents are incredible windows into the past, charting a coastline that was rapidly changing under American settlement but still retained much of its untamed character. I was particularly interested in the area off the central California coast, near one of the more established port towns of the era. Zooming in on a beautifully rendered chart from 1857 produced by the formidable hydrographer A.D. Bach, I noticed a small, irregularly shaped island marked a few miles offshore. It was positioned southwest of a prominent coastal headland, clearly delineated and labeled, though the label was partially obscured by foxing on the scan. Using the map's scale, I estimated its size, maybe half a mile long, a quarter of a mile wide. Not huge, certainly not in the class of the Channel Islands, but a distinct landmass nonetheless. My immediate thought was, never heard of an island there. Must be a small named rock or something. I opened a modern nautical chart of the same area on another screen. Nothing. Just open water, with depth soundings consistent with relatively deep water. Certainly too deep for a half-mile-long island to be sitting just below the surface, waiting to reveal itself at low tide. Okay, I thought. Maybe the old map wasn't perfectly accurate. Early surveys, while groundbreaking, weren't always spot on. Perhaps it was a significant rock that was misidentified as an island, or maybe it eroded away or was submerged over time by seismic activity. The California coast is tectonically active, after all. A simple cartographic error seemed the most logical explanation. End of mystery. Or so I thought. The detail that nagged at me was the way it was depicted. It wasn't just a small dot or a hastily drawn symbol. It had a distinct shape. Shoreline contours suggested and appeared to be named, even if I couldn't quite make out the full name on that particular scan. Curiosity, the engine of obsession, prodded me further. I decided to see if this island appeared on other historical maps of the same period. I cross-referenced the location with other charts available in digital archives. I found a British Admiralty chart from 1862, surveyed by a different team, possibly using different methods. And there it was, again, in almost precisely the same location, with a similar shape, albeit labeled slightly differently. This chart was even more detailed, showing some rudimentary topography on the island. 2 independent surveys, separated by a few years and different national hydrographic offices, both showing a distinct island where there should be none. That significantly reduced the probability of a simple, isolated error. Cartographers, especially National Hydrographic Services, cross-referenced data. For the same anomaly to appear on charts from both the US and Britain suggested it was either based on a common, perhaps flawed source, or it was something they both genuinely observed during their surveys. My research escalated. I started searching for any written accounts from the mid-19th century that might mention this island. Ship logs, coastal reports, newspaper articles from the nearest towns, historical accounts of California's coastline. It was slow, painstaking work, sifting through digitized, often poorly indexed, documents. Mentions of the well-known Channel Islands were frequent, as were references to prominent coastal features, but nothing about a smaller island off this specific stretch of Central California coast. No shipwrecks attributed to it, no accounts of landings, no description of its flora or fauna, which you might expect for even a small, rocky island. It was like the maps acknowledged its existence, but the written history of the period was silent. This silence felt heavier than a simple omission. It felt deliberate, or at least profoundly strange. Why would such a feature, if it existed and was significant enough to be charted by two major powers, leave no trace in contemporary narratives? Unless it was fleeting. A sandbar that temporarily grew large? But the charts depicted it with solidity, not as a shoal or a temporary feature. I began compiling a list of every historical map I could find that depicted this area. I searched university library collections, national archives, online repositories. The pattern held. Charts from the 1850s, 60s, and even into the 1870s consistently showed this island. Some labeled it explicitly, others with just an island symbol. The names varied slightly. One called it Baches Island, possibly after the surveyor. Another Isla Perdida, Lost Island, prescient perhaps. And a third simply Offshore Island. The variations in naming were not unusual for the era, as different surveyors or cartographers might assign names or use local, unofficial ones. What mattered was the geographical feature itself, consistently plotted in the same general location relative to the known coastline and bathymetric soundings were available on those early charts. The clustering of the island symbol on these charts, all pointing to the same general coordinates, was undeniable. I created an overlay, digitally aligning several of these historical charts and a modern satellite image. The spectral shape of the disappeared island shimmered on my screen, sitting in the middle of an empty expanse of ocean. It was stark, visual proof of the anomaly. It wasn't just one mapmaker's mistake. It was a feature that appeared to have been observed, charted, and then vanished. Not just from maps, but from collective memory, from historical records, from the very face of the earth, at least according to modern observation. The simple error explanation was beginning to feel increasingly inadequate. The consistency across multiple sources from a specific historical period, followed by total absence, pointed towards something far more intriguing and potentially far more unsettling. Was it truly gone? Or was its disappearance from the record something more complex? The title I'd mentally assigned to this growing mystery, The Disappearing Island Off the Coast of California, seemed increasingly apt. And the possibilities, ranging from fascinating geological events to something far more deliberate, began to occupy my thoughts almost entirely. The hunt for clues intensified. I broadened my search beyond just maps and general historical accounts. I started looking for specific survey reports from that era. The United States Coast Survey, precursor to NOAA, kept meticulous records. Their annual reports often detailed the work conducted, the challenges faced, and sometimes even descriptions of the areas surveyed. I spent weeks poring over digitized volumes of these reports from the 1850s through the 1870s, focusing on the districts covering the Central California coast. Finding specific mention of this particular offshore feature proved frustratingly difficult. There were general descriptions of the coastline, mentions of prominent islands and rocks, details about setting up triangulation points, but no explicit narrative describing the survey or characteristics of Baches Island or Isla Perdida. It was as if the reports detailed the process of surveying the area but skirted around describing this specific result. This silence in the official reports felt significant, almost as significant as its presence on the charts. Why document the survey of the adjacent coastline and larger features, but omit detailed notes on this seemingly charted island? Was it considered too small to warrant extensive description? Or was there another reason? I also delved into early geological surveys of California. The geological landscape of the state was a major focus of scientific inquiry in the mid-19th century, driven partly by the gold rush and the potential for other resource extraction. I searched for any geological descriptions of offshore features in that region. Again, the larger Channel Islands were well documented, but any mention of smaller offshore landmasses in the specific location of my mystery island was absent. Geologists of the era were keen observers. If a rocky island existed a few miles off the coast, you would expect at least a passing reference in their field notes or reports, especially if it had any unusual geological characteristics or if it impacted coastal processes. Their silence mirrored that of the historical accounts, deepening the puzzle. My focus shifted from simply finding the island on historical records to trying to understand why it disappeared. The most straightforward geological explanation would be rapid erosion, perhaps combined with seismic subsidence. Could a small, non-volcanic island made of soft rock or sediment simply be worn away by the relentless Pacific waves and currents in a relatively short period, say 20-30 years between the last charting and subsequent surveys? It's possible, but unlikely for a landmass depicted with distinct contours on charts. Erosion is a continuous process, and while coastlines change, an entire island vanishing without a trace geologically within decades is rare, unless it was volcanic and exploded or subsided rapidly, or was purely sedimentary like a large sand cay. The geology of the California coast in that area doesn't strongly suggest recent volcanic activity capable of forming and then destroying an island of that size within that time frame. And a large, semi-permanent sand cay seems unlikely given the depiction on the charts. I researched historical seismic events in the region. Major earthquakes can cause uplift or subsidence. Could an earthquake have caused the island to sink below sea level? It's a plausible geological mechanism. I looked at seismic records and historical accounts of quakes in the latter half of the 19th century off the central California coast. There were significant events, certainly, but I couldn't find any records describing the consequences of these quakes, specifically mentioning the disappearance of an island or significant changes to the offshore landscape in that precise location. Again, silence, where you might expect at least anecdotal evidence or notes in subsequent surveys. Another possibility, though less probable given the timescale, was a massive landslide or slumping event from the mainland coast that somehow obliterated or covered the island. But the distance offshore makes this scenario difficult to envision without leaving massive, obvious changes to the mainland coastline itself, which aren't recorded. As the geological explanations became less convincing based on the available historical data, the cover-up aspect of the mystery began to feel more compelling. Why would an island be deliberately removed from charts and records? The mid to late 19th century was a time of significant military expansion and strategic consideration, especially on the Pacific coast. California was a rapidly growing state with important ports and increasing naval activity. Could the island have been deemed strategically important? Perhaps as a lookout post, a coaling station, or even a base for operations? If so, its existence might have been initially charted, but then its strategic value recognized, leading to a decision to classify its existence or even physically remove it or alter its appearance. This thought seemed far-fetched at first, bordering on conspiracy theory. but the persistent presence on historical charts followed by utter eradication from all modern records felt like it required an explanation beyond simple error or natural processes. I started researching the history of military installations and activities along that stretch of coast during the relevant period. Fortifications, naval bases, restricted areas. While there were military developments further north and south, the specific area adjacent to the island's charted location didn't immediately jump out as a major hub of classified activity during that time. However, military activities aren't always publicly documented, especially in their early stages. Could the island have been considered for a purpose that was ultimately abandoned, but the decision to erase it from the record persisted? This line of inquiry was difficult, as truly classified historical information from that era, if it exists, is not easily accessible. Freedom of Information Act, FOIA requests are generally for more recent documents, and even then, historical records can be difficult to pry loose. The lack of any physical evidence in modern times remained the most perplexing aspect. Satellite imagery is incredibly detailed. Even if the island had subsided significantly, you might expect to see a shoal area, a change in water color indicating shallows, or at least some unusual bathymetry. I downloaded detailed bathymetric data for the area from NOAA. I analyzed it closely. While the seabed isn't perfectly flat, it shows depths entirely consistent with open ocean in the location where the island was charted. No prominent seamount, no submerged ridge, no hint of a landmass just below the surface. This either meant the island was completely gone, eroded, or subsided to the point of being indistinguishable from the surrounding seabed, or it was never there in the first place, and its depiction on numerous historical charts was the result of some widespread, coordinated error or deception. But who would orchestrate such a deception and why across multiple independent surveys? I began to consider the possibility of a shared, flawed source for the historical maps. Early surveys often relied on triangulation from shore and potentially sightings from ships. Was it possible that a prominent offshore rock, perhaps misidentified as an island during a distant observation, was then propagated across multiple charts? Or perhaps a temporary phenomenon, like a large iceberg, though unlikely off California, or even a persistent mirage, was mistaken for land and charted. These possibilities felt like grasping at straws, trying to force a simple explanation onto a complex anomaly. The detail and consistency of the island's depiction on some of the charts argued against it being a mere distant sighting of a rock. My research had hit a wall in official historical documents and geological data. The next logical step seemed to be local history and potentially folklore. Coastal communities often retain oral histories or written accounts that never make it into formal archives. I started looking for local historical societies, libraries, and museums near the section of the California coast corresponding to the island's charted location. I contacted a few historians and researchers specializing in the history of that specific region. Most were helpful, but had never heard of any island in that location besides the well-known ones. One elderly gentleman, a retired fisherman and amateur historian, mentioned hearing old tales from his grandfather about a phantom island or sailor's trick out in that general area, but dismissed it as superstition or misidentification of fog banks or floating debris. He recounted stories of sailors seeing land that wasn't there, or lights in the fog attributed to this phantom island. While intriguing from a folklore perspective, this didn't offer concrete evidence of a real landmass that had been charted. I also searched historical newspapers from the coastal towns nearest the island's location, going back to the mid-19th century. I looked for mentions of ships striking uncharted objects, strange lights offshore, unusual land sightings, or even discussions among locals about geographical features. The digitized archives were extensive, but the search terms were tricky. I found articles about shipwrecks, yes, but none located specifically at the coordinates of the charted island, or attributed to striking an unknown landmass there. I found accounts of maritime traffic, fishing grounds, and coastal development, but no reference to a small island existing just a few miles offshore in that area. It seemed impossible that a charted island, even a small one, wouldn't warrant a single mention in local papers over several decades, whether for its use, a mishap near it, or even just as a geographical reference point for fishing or navigation. The continued silence in local records was as perplexing as the silence in official reports. The more I dug, the deeper the rabbit hole seemed to go, and the less clear the answer became. Was it an error? A collective delusion propagated across multiple cartographic institutions? Or was it something real? Something that existed, that was then deliberately scrubbed from the record for reasons unknown? The latter possibility, while bordering on conspiracy, began to feel more plausible given the sheer volume of historical charts showing the feature compared to the utter lack of any other corroborating evidence. Historical accounts, geological data, or modern physical presence. If it was just a simple error on one chart, propagating to a couple of others is understandable. But for it to appear consistently on charts from different countries and different survey teams over several decades, only to vanish completely from all subsequent records in the physical world, that felt like it required an active force behind its disappearance from the documentation, if not from reality itself. I decided to try a different approach. Instead of looking for direct mentions of the island disappearing, I looked for any changes in survey practices or policies around that specific time period, late 1870s, 1880s, when the island seems to stop appearing on new charts. Were there new, more accurate survey methods introduced that might have revealed a previous error? Yes. Survey technology was constantly improving. Triangulation techniques became more refined. New-sounding methods were developed. It's possible that later, more accurate surveys simply failed to find the feature, leading cartographers to omit it from new charts, assuming the older charts were in error. This is a strong argument for the map error side of the debate. The earlier surveys might have been less precise, maybe misinterpreting a distant rock or a temporary phenomenon. However, if that were the case, you might expect some note or correction issued by the hydrographic offices. A bulletin indicating that feature X, previously charted at location Y, had been resurveyed and found not to exist, or to be merely a submerged rock, and would be removed from future charts. I searched for such bulletins or notices to mariners from that period. Again, nothing explicit about this specific feature. Changes were made to charts constantly, corrections issued for newly discovered rocks, changes in aids to navigation, etc. But no official declaration that an island previously charted off the central California coast had been delisted due to error or non-existence. This lack of official correction felt odd. If a significant feature like an island was being removed after decades of being charted, you'd expect some formal process or announcement, especially by cautious hydrographic services whose primary goal was safe navigation. Their silence on the removal of the feature, contrasting with their earlier charting of it, felt more aligned with a deliberate effort to ignore or suppress its existence from that point forward. I also considered the possibility that the island existed but was extremely low-lying or volatile, only appearing under certain conditions, extreme low tide, calm seas. But the historical charts depict it as a solid landmass, not a drying reef or a temporary sandbar. The symbols and contours used suggested a feature that was reliably above water. If it were just a temporary phenomenon, why would it be consistently charted across multiple surveys over decades? That level of consistency points to something more permanent, at least during the period it was being charted. The potential reasons for a cover-up remained speculative, but seemed to fit the pattern of charting followed by silence. Strategic military use was one possibility. Another could involve valuable natural resources, perhaps minerals on the island itself, or oil-gas reserves beneath it that were discovered and subsequently kept secret, with the island being removed from charts to deter exploration or claims. The mid to late 19th century saw early oil exploration in California. An offshore find, combined with a small isolated island, could have been a compelling reason for a private entity or the government to attempt to control access and information. Resource speculation is a powerful driver of secrecy. I decided to search for historical land claims or resource exploration permits in the offshore area during that period. This was even more challenging, as records from that era are often scattered or incomplete. I managed to find some records related to offshore oil leases much later in the 20th century, but nothing from the 19th century covering that specific area. This doesn't mean there was no exploration or interest, just that I couldn't find a documented link. The lack of evidence could just be due to the difficulty of accessing or interpreting historical records, or it could be because any such activities were kept entirely off the books. Another line of inquiry involved looking for any unusual events or activities reported in the area around the time the island stopped appearing on charts, late 1870s. Was there any increase in military presence? Any reports of unusual construction or demolition activity offshore? Any environmental incidents? Again, general historical records for that specific patch of ocean were sparse. Major port activities were documented, as were ship movements between them. But the open ocean few miles offshore, unless something dramatic happened, it wasn't typically the subject of detailed public record. This quietness itself could be interpreted in different ways. Either nothing remarkable happened there, or something happened that was deliberately kept quiet. The hypothesis of a deliberate cover-up, while lacking definitive proof, started to feel more compelling than the various error or natural disappearance scenarios. A widespread, multi-decade cartographic error across multiple independent surveys seemed highly improbable. An island vanishing without a trace geologically within a few decades, leaving no hint in bathymetry, also seemed unlikely given the depiction on the charts. A deliberate act of charting followed by a deliberate act of erasing from the record, perhaps due to strategic value, resource discovery, or some other unknown factor, started to feel like the explanation that best fit the available, albeit incomplete, evidence. It would explain the presence on historical maps, the absence on modern ones, and the puzzling silence in other contemporary records. But proving a cover-up requires more than just circumstantial evidence and logical deduction based on anomalies. It requires a smoking gun, a leaked document, a credible witness, undeniable physical evidence. All I had were discrepancies on old maps and a void in modern data. I needed to find something more concrete, something that bridged the gap between the charted past and the empty present. I started thinking about potential unconventional sources of information. Shipwreck databases sometimes contain unexpected details, locations that don't match modern charts, descriptions of features encountered. I trawled through databases of historical shipwrecks off the California coast, looking for any incidents in the general area of the charted island. I found several wrecks, but their recorded positions were either too close to the mainland, further offshore in much deeper water, or clearly associated with known hazards like rocks or reefs that are still charted today. None seemed directly linked to striking an island in the specific location of my mystery. This was another piece of negative evidence. If an island existed there even for a few decades, it seems likely a ship would have eventually run afoul of it, especially during the era of sail and less precise navigation. The absence of any recorded wreck on or near the charted island was puzzling. It could suggest the island was small and easily avoided, or that ship traffic in that precise spot was minimal, or that it wasn't there when ships were passing, despite being on the charts. I also considered early aerial photography, though truly useful coverage for that specific location would likely be from the mid-20th century onwards, long after the island disappeared from charts. Still, I checked historical aerial surveys available through geological surveys and other archives. Looking at photos from the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, there was still nothing but open water in the area. This confirmed the absence in the relatively recent past, but didn't help explain its supposed existence decades earlier. The thought occurred to me that perhaps the name Isla Perdida, Lost Island, which appeared on one of the historical charts, wasn't just a descriptive name assigned by a later cartographer, but possibly a name reflecting the island's already precarious or mysterious nature even in the 19th century. Maybe it was known to appear and disappear, like a phantom island of folklore, but one that happened to be present during the specific periods when the surveys took place. While this leans towards folklore, some legends are rooted in reality. However, the consistent plotting on multiple charts suggests a more stable feature than a fleeting one. I decided to try reaching out to hydrographic experts directly. I contacted professors of cartography, marine archaeology, and historical geography at universities known for these programs. I presented my findings: the cluster of historical charts showing the island, the lack of modern evidence, the absence in historical accounts and official records. I asked for their professional opinion. The responses were varied. Some dismissed it outright as a known cartographic anomaly or a persistent error based on a single flawed early source, the details of which might be lost to time. They argued that propagation of errors was common in historical mapmaking, especially before standardized surveys and GPS. Others found it intriguing, but couldn't offer a definitive explanation without delving deeply into the original survey notes and triangulations, which might be difficult or impossible to do remotely or even on-site. One professor suggested it could be a misinterpretation of early-sounding data, where a shallow bank was mistakenly charted as an island. However, the distinct shape and suggested contours on some maps argued against this being a simple depth misinterpretation. The concept of a persistent error, while plausible for a single chart or perhaps two related ones, still didn't fully satisfy me for multiple independent surveys over 2 decades. How could separate survey teams, presumably taking their own readings, all agree on the existence and approximate location and shape of a feature that wasn't there? Unless they weren't independent in their initial findings, perhaps relying on a preliminary, flawed survey that everyone used as a base map before conducting their own detailed work. This is possible. Early surveys were expensive and time-consuming, and it wasn't uncommon for later surveys to use earlier ones as a starting point. If the error originated in the very first survey of that specific offshore patch, it could have been propagated. But even then, subsequent surveyors would ideally verify major features like islands. I needed to find details about the very first survey that charted this island. This proved to be challenging. The 1857 U.S. Coast Survey chart by Bachi was one of the earliest detailed charts of that specific area, but there might have been preliminary sketch surveys or reconnaissances before that. Pinpointing the absolute origin of the island on a map was difficult. If I could trace it back to a single source and potentially find the original field notes from that specific survey, it might shed light on whether it was a genuine observation, a misinterpretation, or something else entirely. However, finding such specific, granular historical documents from the mid-19th century survey expeditions is a monumental task, requiring access to deep archival collections and often expertise in deciphering century-old handwriting and survey notations. The possibility of a deliberate cover-up continued to lurk in the background. If the island existed and was removed from records, there had to be a reason. Military, resources, something else? I tried thinking outside the box. Could it have been used for something temporary and clandestine? A base for smugglers or pirates, though less likely by the 1870s? A quarantine station? A secret research outpost? These ideas were increasingly speculative, bordering on fiction, but they arose from the frustration of not finding a simple, logical explanation grounded in geology or common cartographic errors. The sheer mystery of its disappearance from the record felt like it demanded a more active, intentional explanation than passive erosion or a widespread, uncorrected mistake. The path forward seemed to involve getting my hands on more primary source documents, specifically original survey field notes, if they existed and were accessible, and perhaps diving deeper into historical records of specific maritime activities or resource exploration efforts in the area that might not be in public databases. It was clear this wasn't a mystery that could be solved purely through easily accessible digital archives. It required boots on the ground, or at least hands in the dusty boxes of physical archives. The potential payoff, uncovering the truth behind a disappearing island, felt worth the effort, even if the truth turned out to be a mundane explanation like a forgotten error. But the nagging possibility of something more, something deliberately hidden, was a powerful motivator. My research led me to the National Archives and the NOAA Library's historical collection, repositories of original U.S. Coast Survey documents. Planning a trip to access these physical archives was necessary. Digital scans are useful, but often critical details are lost or hard to interpret. Original field notebooks, correspondence between surveyors, and large-format original charts might contain annotations, marginalia, or details that were omitted or unclear in the published versions or digital scans. This felt like a crucial next step. If the island was genuinely surveyed, the field notes should contain observations about its location, size, and potentially even a brief description of its appearance. If it was a persistent error, perhaps there would be notes questioning its existence in later surveys of adjacent areas, even if the correction wasn't formally published. While planning the archival visit, I continued to look for any other potential sources of information. I started reading historical accounts of ship voyages that passed through that area in the mid to late 19th century. Sometimes personal diaries or letters from sailors or passengers contained observations about the coastline and offshore features that didn't make it into official logs. This was like searching for needles in a haystack, relying on chance encounters with relevant details in vast amounts of unrelated text. However, I did come across a few intriguing, albeit vague, references. One sailor's diary from 1875 mentioned seeing land where the charts said was open sea off the California coast, but the location was described imprecisely. Another account from a local newspaper in the 1880s briefly mentioned fishermen avoiding a certain area offshore due to unpredictable currents and strange sights, but again, lacked specific details or a precise location that clearly matched the charted island. These were tantalizing fragments, but far from conclusive evidence. I also revisited the geological data with a specific focus on the possibility of a submerged feature that isn't quite an island, but might have been mistaken for one in earlier surveys or might be the remnants of a subsided landmass. I consulted more detailed bathymetric charts, looking for any subtle rises on the seabed in the vicinity of the island's charted coordinates. I did find some minor variations in depth, consistent with a slightly uneven seabed, but nothing resembling a seamount or a large bank that would suggest the recent presence of a significant landmass. However, I learned that early bathymetric data collection was less precise than modern sonar. Could the soundings on the historical charts, when overlaid on modern bathymetry, reveal something? I spent hours comparing the depth soundings marked on the 19th century charts with modern data. There were discrepancies, certainly, but these were often attributable to differences in sounding technology and positioning accuracy of the time. There wasn't a clear pattern that screamed submerged island. The more I analyzed the available data, the more the mystery seemed to deepen rather than resolve. The historical evidence for the island's existence on paper was strong, appearing on multiple charts from reputable sources over a significant period. The evidence for its existence in reality, past or present, outside of those charts, was virtually non-existent. No mention in historical accounts, no geological evidence of its formation or disappearance in a rapid time frame, no remnants on the seabed according to modern surveys. This stark contrast was the heart of the puzzle. It wasn't just a feature that disappeared, it was a feature that seemed to exist only in the cartographic record, yet with a consistency that argued against simple error. The cover-up hypothesis, while still speculative, gained traction in my mind as the simple map error explanation became increasingly difficult to reconcile with the evidence. If the island was truly surveyed and charted, and then deliberately removed from subsequent records, who would benefit? And how could they achieve such a complete erasure from all official documentation and public awareness? A government entity like the Navy or a precursor to Homeland Security could have the authority and means to restrict information and control mapping. A powerful private entity, perhaps involved in resource extraction or some other secret venture, might also have the influence. The mid to late 19th century was an era with less public scrutiny and fewer regulations compared to today, which might have made such a cover-up more feasible. Thinking about the mechanics of a cover-up, it would involve not only omitting the island from new charts, but also potentially destroying or altering original survey records, discouraging or silencing witnesses, and perhaps even physically altering the location if the island was small enough. Though this seems highly improbable for a natural island, the sheer effort required for such a comprehensive erasure across multiple agencies, US and British hydrographic offices, potentially geological surveys, etc., over decades seems immense, almost impossibly so. This difficulty argued against the cover-up theory and pushed me back towards the idea of a sophisticated, long-propagated error. Perhaps the key lay in identifying the potential original source of the charting error, if that's what it was. Could there have been a single, influential preliminary survey or report that first placed the island on the map, and subsequent surveyors, instead of independently verifying its existence with precision, simply copied it onto their own charts? This wasn't unheard of in the history of cartography, where inaccuracies from earlier maps could be perpetuated for centuries if not rigorously checked. If I could find evidence of such a foundational, potentially flawed survey, it would lend significant weight to the map error side. My archival visit was scheduled. I compiled a list of specific record groups and document types I wanted to examine. Original field notebooks, from the U.S. Coast Survey expeditions to the Central California coast in the 1850s, 1870s, correspondence between surveyors and the head office, original hydrographic sheets, the large format working documents from which the final charts were compiled, and any reports or publications related to survey methods or discoveries in that region during that time. I also plan to look for any records related to military land use or activity in the offshore areas during the same period, though I suspected these might be harder to access or might be heavily redacted. The anticipation of getting my hands on these historical documents was immense. After months of staring at digital scans and searching online databases, the prospect of examining the physical records felt like a real breakthrough. It was in these fragile, century-old papers that the truth, or at least a clearer picture of what the surveyors thought they saw, might be revealed. Were there sketches of the island in the field notebooks? Detailed descriptions of its features? Or was its entry surprisingly brief, perhaps based on a distant sighting or second-hand information? The lack of detailed description in the published reports was suspicious. Maybe the original notes would offer more clues. I also prepared a list of questions I hoped the archives might help answer. Who was the primary surveyor responsible for charting that specific offshore area in the 1850s? What methods did they use? Are there any notes about challenges or ambiguities in that section of the survey? Are there any records of subsequent surveys of that area that might have attempted to verify or correct the charting of the island? And crucially, are there any documents explaining why the island stopped appearing on charts after the late 1870s? Was there a formal decision to remove it? And if so, what was the stated reason? Or did it just quietly disappear from new editions? The potential findings ranged from the mundane, a simple error meticulously documented in an overlooked report, to the truly extraordinary, evidence hinting at deliberate concealment. The realistic part of me leaned towards a complex propagated error involving early survey inaccuracies and lack of subsequent verification. The part of me captivated by the mystery held onto the possibility of a cover-up, however improbable it seemed. The silence in the records felt too perfect, too complete, for a purely natural or accidental explanation. Nature and accidents usually leave some trace, some lingering anomaly. The utter lack of any modern trace felt almost enforced. The visit to the archives was both exhilarating and frustrating. Handling the original charts was an incredible experience. The paper felt substantial, the ink faded but still sharp, the annotations sometimes in pencil revealing the working process of the cartographers. I found the original hydrographic sheet for the area surveyed in the 1850s that formed the basis for the published chart showing the island. The island was clearly depicted, triangulated from shore points also marked on the sheet. There were depth soundings marked around it, indicating reasonably deep water dropping off from the island's edges, suggesting it wasn't just a shallow bank. However, the detail on the island itself was minimal, just a shoreline, no internal topography or notes about its composition. This relative lack of detail was slightly unusual for a feature of that size, but not entirely unheard of for an initial reconnaissance. Then I found the field notebooks from the specific survey team. These were handwritten, leather-bound books filled with entries detailing triangulation angles, astronomical observations, sounding data, and descriptions of the coastline and offshore features. I eagerly scanned the entries corresponding to the dates and locations where the island would have been surveyed. There were detailed notes about surveying the adjacent mainland coast, the larger islands, and prominent rocks. There were entries about weather conditions, challenges with equipment, even mundane details about daily life. But when I reached the entries covering the offshore area where the island was charted, the notes about that specific location were surprisingly sparse. There were entries about taking soundings nearby and angles taken towards the general area from shore triangulation points. But there was no detailed description of landing on the island, measuring its dimensions precisely, or noting its geological composition or vegetation, which the surveyors often did for even small islets. The entry related to plotting the island seemed almost perfunctory, referencing observations from a distance rather than a close survey. This was a crucial piece of evidence, supporting the idea that the initial charting might have been based on less rigorous observation than other features. Perhaps it was sighted from a distance, its size and shape estimated, and then plotted on the chart without a close-up survey being conducted. This would increase the likelihood of it being a misidentification. A large rock mistaken for an island, a persistent fog bank, or even a mirage that looked like land from afar under specific atmospheric conditions. If the original plotting was based on such uncertain observations, its perpetuation on subsequent charts could be due to later cartographers copying the feature from this influential early survey without independent verification. However, this didn't fully explain the consistency of its depiction on multiple charts over 2 decades, including a British one. Would independent surveyors simply copy a feature from a foreign chart without any attempt at verification, especially a potential hazard to navigation? Hydrographic services were competitive but also cautious. They aimed for accuracy. While copying did occur, especially in less surveyed regions, a feature like an island would ideally be verified during subsequent surveys of the area. I searched for records of later surveys in the same area. I found reports from the 1870s and 1880s detailing resurveys of parts of the central California coast, aiming for greater precision using improved techniques. I looked for any mention of attempting to locate or verify the island. Again, silence. No explicit entry saying searched for island, charted at X, Y coordinates, found nothing, or corrected position of island, formerly charted here. The island simply wasn't mentioned in the scope of these later surveys, as if it didn't exist or wasn't considered important enough to verify its absence. This was still puzzling. If it was a known feature on older charts, even if suspected to be an error, a resurvey of the area would ideally confirm its non-existence or correct its representation. I also investigated the military records held in the archives. Access was more restricted, and many potentially relevant documents were still classified or heavily redacted. I found some general records about coastal defense and naval activities in California during that era, but nothing specifically mentioning an island in the location I was researching, or any secret military projects offshore. This wasn't surprising. If there was a cover-up for military reasons, these records would likely be among the most difficult to access or the most thoroughly erased. The lack of evidence here could support the cover-up theory as much as refute it. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, especially in the context of classified information. During my archival research, I also stumbled upon a collection of correspondence from a local lighthouse keeper in the late 1870s. While primarily focused on lighthouse operations and weather, one letter contained a brief, intriguing passage. He wrote about unusual lights seen offshore at night in an area where no islands or ships were typically present, and expressed concern that they might mislead mariners. He attributed them to some activity out there, not charted. The location he described was vague, but consistent with the general area where the island was charted. This could be nothing. Fishing boats, phosphorescence, atmospheric phenomenon. But combined with the disappearance of the island from charts around the same time, it felt like a potential, albeit weak, correlation. Could the island have been used for some activity, perhaps military or resource-related, that involved lights, and its presence was then deliberately removed from charts to conceal this activity? The more I delved into the historical records, the more complex the picture became. The initial idea of a simple map error seemed less likely given the multi-source consistency. The idea of a complete natural disappearance without geological trace was also difficult to accept. The cover-up theory, while lacking direct proof, felt increasingly plausible as an explanation for the total erasure from the public record, but the lack of hard evidence and the logistical difficulties of executing such a perfect cover-up across multiple jurisdictions over decades remained significant challenges to this theory. I left the archives with more information, but also with a renewed sense of ambiguity. The survey notes suggested the initial charting might have been based on less precise observations than assumed, strengthening the possibility of an error. But the lack of formal correction, the consistent charting on multiple maps, and the subsequent utter silence in all official records and physical evidence still pointed towards something more deliberate than a simple mistake. It was a frustrating situation, evidence supporting both possibilities, but nothing definitively proving either. I decided to consult with a marine geologist specializing in the California coast. I presented my findings: the historical charts, the modern bathymetry, the lack of historical accounts, the ambiguity in the survey notes. Could a small, rocky island form and disappear so quickly in this region due to natural processes like erosion or seismic activity without leaving a trace? The geologist explained that while dramatic coastal changes can occur, particularly with volcanic islands or unstable sedimentary formations, a rocky island of the size suggested by the charts would typically leave some lasting mark on the seabed if it subsided or eroded away. A seamount, a bank, or at least a significant debris field. The current detailed bathymetry showing relatively smooth, deep seabed in that exact location made a recent, complete disappearance of a rocky island due to natural processes less likely, according to her expertise. This tilted the scale slightly away from the purely natural explanation and back towards either a sophisticated error or something deliberate. The possibility of a sophisticated error needed further consideration. Could the early surveyors have misinterpreted a complex interaction of currents, waves, and perhaps floating debris, or a kelp bed that, from a distance and under certain lighting conditions, mimicked the appearance of land? While this sounds unlikely for experienced surveyors, visual misidentification did happen, especially in areas where access was difficult or conditions were challenging. If this misidentification was then recorded and propagated, it could explain the presence on maps without the island ever having truly existed as depicted. However, the shape and detail shown on some of the charts still felt like they depicted something more substantial than a temporary visual anomaly. The more I considered the cover-up aspect, the more I realized it didn't necessarily have to be a massive multi-agency conspiracy orchestrated at the highest levels. Could it have been a more localized effort, perhaps related to a specific, temporary military operation, or a limited duration, high-value resource extraction project that required secrecy? Once the operation or project was concluded, the island was no longer needed, and its existence was simply allowed to fade from memory and maps without formal correction. This type of soft cover-up, where information is simply not updated or verified rather than actively erased, might be more plausible than a scenario involving the destruction of records. I started researching historical instances of islands appearing or disappearing elsewhere in the world, focusing on those that were charted and later vanished. Most were volcanic islands, like Graham Island off Sicily, which appeared and disappeared in the 19th century, or temporary sand formations. These cases often involved dramatic, observable geological events and were typically well documented in scientific and historical records. My California island mystery didn't fit neatly into these known categories. Its apparent disappearance lacked the dramatic geological narrative or the clear documentation of other vanishing islands. The investigation had reached a point where definitive proof was elusive. I had strong circumstantial evidence for both the map error and the cover-up scenarios, but nothing conclusive for either. The consistency of the island on historical maps argued against a simple, isolated error. The utter lack of modern physical evidence and the silence in other historical records argued against it being a real, permanent landmass that simply eroded away. The possibility of a complex propagated error originating from imprecise early observations remained plausible, but the lack of official correction was strange. The possibility of a deliberate cover-up explained the silence, but lacked direct evidence of the motive or the means. I decided to compile all my findings, presenting the evidence for both sides of the argument. On one hand, the case for error, initial survey potentially based on distant, imprecise sightings. propagation of this error onto subsequent charts without rigorous independent verification. Later, more accurate surveys simply failing to find the feature and quietly omitting it. On the other hand, the case for cover-up. Consistent charting across multiple sources and decades suggesting a real feature. Lack of natural geological explanation for its rapid, trace-free disappearance. Complete absence from historical narratives and modern surveys suggesting deliberate omission or suppression. Vague local lore and tangential historical notes potentially hinting at unusual activity in the area. It felt unsatisfying to not arrive at a definitive conclusion, but perhaps that was the most realistic outcome. Not all mysteries have neat resolutions, especially those buried under layers of time and potentially intentional obfuscation. The disappearing island off the coast of California remained just that, a mystery, hovering in the space between historical charting and modern absence, between possible error and potential cover-up. My research had confirmed the anomaly's existence in the historical record, and its absence in the present highlighted the inconsistencies in the available data and explored the plausible and less plausible explanations. But the ultimate truth of whether Isla Perdida was a phantom born of faulty observation or a real place deliberately erased from the world remained, for now, lost to the mists of time and the complexities of history. This journey through archives, maps, and databases had revealed the fragility of recorded history and the potential for gaps and anomalies, whether accidental or intentional. It served as a reminder that our understanding of the world, even its physical geography, is built upon layers of observation, recording, and interpretation. And sometimes those layers conceal more than they reveal. The mystery of the disappearing island serves as a compelling footnote in the history of California's coast, a cartographic ghost that persists in challenging our assumptions about what is real and what is simply recorded.